Hello, everyone. Welcome to another issue of the Saito Social.
Mhm.
Today, we're really happy to have Ross Green with us, who's recently published this book, Essential Guide to Blockchain Platforms, in which he features Saito amongst other major players in the space. And we're just really glad to have him on board today and get the chance to talk to him about the writing of the book, his crypto journey, and similar. Thanks, Ross, and welcome.
Thanks, guys, for having me.
Yep, that was right.
Yeah,
Cool.
it feels a bit like deja vu because Richard had a power spike. So this is technically attempt two. So if it feels like we're just sleepwalking this, it's because we've already done the first 5 minutes. We
Yeah,
know what's happening.
don't break the
Um,
fourth wall.
but but Ross, right when Richard was dropping, you were telling us about how you got into crypto, how you started, what your background is.
Yep.
Uh, you share that with us.
Yeah. So basically, as I said, my background's in IT. I studied electronic software engineering, computer science at university. And yeah, way back in around 2000, around when the dot-com bubble burst, I was working on like voice over IP solutions and all sorts. That was a fun time. And then yeah, a few years later, I worked for another company called Prognosis, which was basically remote performance monitoring for companies like banks and big network companies like Cisco and Avaya. So the idea is we monitor their machines. It was a remote monitoring tool. And, interestingly, during and around the GFC, when a lot of companies were going bust, uh, our company made record profits because what happened around that time of the GFC is all these ATM machines were going offline as people were going crazy, withdrawing cash from their ATM machines. And so all these companies were buying up our product to now monitor these ATM machines because they didn't want to send network engineers to go and do a 3-hour drive to go and fix these things, which was costing these companies a lot of money. So that our product was making sales through the roof, and we made like a record-breaking year. It was quite ironic, really.
That's
So quite a
yeah,
fond
Here's the
memory for that.
Timothy guy there. There
yeah.
you go, Tim.
The
Folks at
similar time
Prognosis love you.
I was working in embedding risk and compliance software inside banks, where I
Yeah,
was usually being told like, okay, so now we've got the risk and compliance software installed. How do we not use it? That was the
yeah,
But
yeah,
I was
exactly.
too young and naive to understand anything about the ability to short things or how finance works. So I was just like, this seems a bit odd
Mm.
in China. So interesting time, I think, for people in tech.
Mm.
It was. It was.
I mean,
Cool.
that's pre-Bitcoin. I think, like Richard and I have mentioned when we've spoken publicly, we both got into crypto, I guess, 2012-ish, 2013. And for me, it was China related. It was, you hear about Bitcoin, but I think there was this. I think there's usually a 6-month period for people when they run into
Mm.
crypto where they go from, oh, that's interesting, but it's going to be a scam,
Yeah,
to learning enough about it where it's actually maybe there's something here, and then the process kind of opens up. So I think for us it was triggered for me in part by China, right? Because
Mm.
looking at China, being in China, dealing with China problems, you could really see state-run finances real issues. Like Chinese people
Mm.
can't collect international payments. A
Yeah,
simple thing is a huge issue, right?
yeah.
Um, you
It
know,
was
you're
it was my credit card for me. I couldn't get a Chinese credit card, and I could send my tax-paid Chinese salary to Australia if I went to the bank with all the relevant tax documents and spent 4 hours in a queue.
yeah.
Or I discovered I could buy and sell Bitcoin. This was after I knew about it, but it was the killer for me. Was like, oh, I can actually just send myself this money, and there's no one interceding, so I can pay
Yeah.
off my Australian credit card because I can't get a Chinese one. And that was for me that kind of flip from this is interesting to there's a lot to this.
Uh, Before we drag this into a China podcast,
Yeah.
the question I was leading to was, I think people who are discovering crypto, there's usually something that gets them into it where there's a certain amount of intellectual curiosity required, or what brought you into the space from like remote network monitoring to, okay,
Yeah.
I'm interested in crypto, I'm learning about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, around that time, I was still a software engineer, and it was around 2012 for me when I heard about Bitcoin. It was more just word of mouth at the time. I was always a keen investor from around, I became a keen investor in, IT project shares after the GFC, which was probably a good time to start becoming a keen investor because now the worst is out of the way. And I started learning about, oh, wow, the stock
Mhm.
market's pretty volatile, isn't it? And all these tech companies. And I started getting into investing then. And then I was talking to my friend about, what kind of other projects could we invest in? And, my friend was like, well, do you know much about Bitcoin? And I didn't at the time, right? He was telling me about
Mhm.
Bitcoin. It was just a word of mouth thing at the time. And then I luckily met some friends who were setting up a Bitcoin exchange, Bitcoin exchange then. Locally, there was a small local exchange which since doesn't exist anymore. But
Mhm.
at the time, they were talking to me about it, and it just a few more people here and there in small pockets were talking about it, and I started to become interested in it. But I looked at it and I thought, well, this does sound interesting, and it sounds very much different, so different from any other project I've ever invested in, and
Mhm.
everything else. But the problem is because I was used to buying stocks and shares. Well, that wasn't like this, right? So I thought, well, this sounds like it has potential, but how do I put money into this? And what I was finding was that, well, you've got there's no exchanges at that point. Okay, well, oh no, you've got to set up a wallet. Ah, right. Well, but what happens, if I don't set up the correct wallet, or what's the reputation of these wallets? And then what happens if my laptop goes bust and blah, 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 blah. And in the end, I just decided the risk was a bit too high. And so I didn't get in. I took a bit of interest in it, but I sort of up and down for a few years. I took a bit of interest, and then I started to see the price rising more and more. And I thought, well, I'll be patient. I'll wait for it to pull back. I'll be patient, And unfortunately, that patience didn't work for me this time because it never really pulled back to the prices I want. And so in the end, I didn't actually buy Bitcoin until about 2016, 2017, which,
Mhm.
in the grand scheme of things wasn't too bad. But that
Yeah,
was
I don't think you can be complaining at this point.
no,
No.
no. I can't be complaining at all. In the grand scheme of things, you're absolutely right. It's just relative to what could have happened, but
Mhm.
that's cool. It was just something I was sort of interested in, but didn't really go down the rabbit hole until a lot later with this, until things really started getting traction around that sort of 2017, 2018 period. And that's when I started really looking into the tech more, because I've got a tech background. So I thought, well, I don't want to just get into this just for price, which is what most people do. The way I invest in projects is I want to understand what the technology is, what the potential of it is, where it's
Mhm.
going, what the roadmap is, um, and look at it and believe in it, not just believing in price. Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think that's probably true for long termers too,
yeah,
because like, Bitcoin goes up and it goes down. Uh, I think, Richard, we probably agree that most people have maybe a 6 month to a 1 year window when they think about crypto as a speculative activity.
yeah,
Yeah, certainly
And the
true for
people who
me.
really want to reach. Hmm?
It's certainly true for me. Like I was sort of seeing people in like Linux podcasts talk about it. I knew some people in Beijing who were doing things with it, and you were sort of more into it than I was initially, so we talked a bit about it. And it was that it takes a while of being exposed, having it around, to then want to go and dig that next level and say, well, okay, beyond like people talking excitedly about it, how does this sort of work? What's it doing?
I
What is it?
mean,
Yeah.
what's interesting for me is this seems it's a different approach into crypto than the one I was used to, right? Like mine
Mm.
was China and international, doing international business, and you're talking about approaching consensus mechanisms as started as the financial aspect of it, but being a serious researcher, so to speak, coming from like analyzing tech companies and analyzing stocks, you know. So.
Yeah. It's also really
Hmm.
interesting for me to hear. I think it's a unique perspective because there are a lot of people who do come in purely as like chart jockeys. They've come in and they look at it purely as they might say investment, but generally speculation, because
Hmm.
that's kind of the world they've entered post 2017 or so.
It's
Um,
2017. It's the Ethereum token thing, because as soon as we
mm,
have the Ethereum token boom, you have a bunch of tokens that are marketed where it's a ticker, but there's not really anything fundamental on the tech level happening, right?
yeah.
I'm actually wondering if one of the reasons you're digging into the fundamentals is because you came in before that. And so your
Mm,
perceptions of crypto, like old timers like Richard and I
right.
are, you've got to focus on, that it's immature technology, right? Like I don't know if you've ever looked at like the Satoshi code base, but if you look at it, you're like,
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Yeah, for me, look, I mean, I went to a few meetup groups and all sorts, and they were fun back then, the meetup groups. You really felt like you were part of this really secret early adopter group that was getting into something that people didn't really know about. Now, these meetups now are not the same. They're all very retail and commercial.
yeah,
So it's very different now. Like I went to a conference recently and it was all very retail, like very kind of you can borrow against your Bitcoin and blah, 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 blah. And like, okay, well, does that
yeah,
mean that, you take custody of the keys? And they didn't know the answer, right? They didn't know the
yeah,
answer. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'm not sure
yeah,
if I want to get involved in your product then. But back in around
yeah,
2012, 2013, you talked to some really interesting people who understood the tech and
Mm,
really understood,
yeah,
you know, what Bitcoin was about. But now it's different. It's gone a little bit very commercial. So when you go to the meetups and things, I don't get a whole lot out of them,
yeah.
especially the one I went to recently trying to promote my book. But yeah, look, I mean, I don't know whether this is a good segue into why I wrote the book, but that's basically we're sort of leading into now, I suppose, why I wrote the book. Because is that a good point, or is that
yeah, it's a great
something
segue
that
now.
you want to ask before?
Why did you write the book? That's what I
Yeah,
want to know.
yeah, right, yeah. Okay, good. All right. Is it not the most subtle hint there, was it? But yeah. So so yeah, basically, you see, as you guys were saying, that most people are in crypto and blockchain, if you like, for price, right? They're all about, okay, you know, when's the next thing that's going to pump, or what's the next shiny object, right?
Mhm.
And I knew that from my investing background that, after years of experience in the stock market, that you've got to be very, very careful with that, right? With that approach, right? And I find that if and lots of investing books will talk about this, right? If you're going to invest in a project, you need to believe in it and understand it. Because if you believe in it and understand it, you're more likely to follow it, and then you're more likely to make better decisions, right?
You're a lot
Whereas,
less likely to panic and sell. I think that's
yeah,
absolutely true. Absolutely.
Yeah.
that's it. And so what I found was that a lot of people were, getting into these projects just because someone else told you. They made a decision on a whim. It was kind of just
Mm.
oh, you've got to get into this and blah, 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 right? But they didn't really understand what they were getting into. In actual fact, someone I spoke to very recently said, so why did you buy Bitcoin then? They said, well, I bought it because other people told me the price is going up. I said, oh yeah, okay, all right. But they wouldn't be able to explain anything about even the benefits of it really. And so what I decided to do was I thought, okay, look, I'm going to write a book because I'm going to write a book that helps people to make better educated decisions, right? Not just decisions on a whim, right? I'm going to write something educational that is going to help people to make better educated decisions. And that may not just be about investing in projects. That could
Mhm.
be, okay, what if you want to be a developer? Which project do you want to pick? Do you want to pick maybe Ethereum because it's got a big developing, thriving community or whatever, or is it something you're just curious about? Or maybe you want to invest in it, or maybe you want to write an article about it, or maybe you want to write a book or something about a particular blockchain, but you don't know which one. Or so the idea was that I thought, right, I'm going to write a book that is kind of a comparative guide that helps people make educated decisions, not just making a decision on a whim, right? Um, and I feel that if you make educated decisions, you're likely to make a better decision and not panic, say, if your
Mm,
investment plummets, right? You would most likely you would buy more of that investment, not sell it off in panic, right?
Mm.
So um, that was what it was. Now, the interesting thing I found was that when I started to write this book, I thought, well, are there other books out there like this? Right? Is there? Because there's umpteen number of blockchain books out there. And what I found was that there wasn't. There was no comparative guide talking about different blockchains like Ethereum v Solana or Solana versus Ethereum versus Algorand or whatever, right? Well, what I found was that there were books on blockchain, like, blockchain for business, or books on explaining blockchain tech, or there was a book on a blockchain like Bitcoin or Ethereum, but there was no book that was a comparative guide that explained or compared different ones.
Yeah.
And so what I thought was, if you're the average person out there, do you need really to read a 500-page book on Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? Probably not. I mean, if you're a developer, yeah, or if you're a geek like me, or maybe you guys, you probably would. I've read Mastering Bitcoin by Andreas Antonopoulos. Yes, right.
I think most of the Bitcoin stuff tends to be ideological.
Yeah.
Like Bitcoin standard that it's not really teaching you about Bitcoin. It's like Bitcoin is hard money. Let's talk about the value of hard money. So it's actually assuming something that's not reasonably true. But
it takes Bitcoin as given.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with having those opinions, but if someone reading that book is not going to get, I think for me, maybe going right back to 2016, a lot of the comparative knowledge was word of mouth, and it was in the community, and you'd get it by being involved in those group chats and being involved in the discussions and going to meetups. And maybe what changed around 2018, proof of stake comes out and we start getting what Richard calls salad chains. I love that term. Where things start getting so complicated with little bits and changes and trade-offs that they get thrown, stuff is just randomly, we're going to have a staking queue, and we're going to have this policy and this congestion policy, and the Ethereum diagrams start getting like bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
It kind of pushed knowledge of this comparative understanding of what's happening, what the trade-offs are, out of the realm of what even people who are interested intellectually in participating.
Well, I mean, I went through that phase. I had I've managed my life through a to-do list, and I had a subsection which was white papers that I wanted to push through, right? That I would take the new, I'd hear about Cardano, and I'd actually go and read technically, try and find the fundamental design document. And I was trying at one point to keep up with that in the space. And I've been through that personal arc of just stopping doing that at some point, where I was reading another tokenomics PowerPoint rather than anything to do with how something actually worked. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I also noticed it's with what you said before. It's a pretty unique book in that thinking about it now, just from what you said, every time I've read comparative blockchain, literature, anything where people are talking seriously about the difference between two things, it's almost invariably with a point. It's taking a side, or it's trying to argue for some third thing. And yours is actually just crystallized for me then what's unique about the book is it really just trying to describe what's in the room, right? For the most part, it's like, you can you don't need to understand the relative politics or those sorts of things. It really just, this is what this chain is setting out to do. This is how it describes itself. And that's quite a unique approach. I don't think I've seen that elsewhere.
Yes, that's an extremely good point. Yeah, thanks for raising that, Richard, because what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to spoon feed readers or put opinions in there. What I wanted to do is say, right, this is all the facts, if you like. These are the way all the different chains work, and blah 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 blah. These are the pros and cons, I guess, of each of the chains. But now you guys can make up your own mind. I'm not going to spoon feed you. I'm not going to influence your decision. I'm just saying that there's this about Ethereum and there's that about Solana. You guys make up your own mind, which is why I leave some open questions in there, which probably sort of makes it a little bit more engaging as well. So, yeah, it was in no intention to, even though I might have my own opinions privately, I'm not going to say that this chain is better than that for that reason, right, in the book, right? So that is up
now here on the podcast.
Yeah, you say that now, like I do in some of my shorts, my YouTube shorts and stuff. That's different, but yeah, but and that's the thing. And the other thing is that, because it's a guide, right? The thing is another huge problem I was finding when I was researching blockchains was that what I had to do, let's say, let's just pick any blockchain, but hey, let's pick Saito. Why not? When I researched Saito, what I had to do, but this applied to all blockchains I was researching, was that I would dig out some YouTube videos. I'd watch some YouTube videos. I'd get some information together. Think, okay, that's good, right? So I took some notes. All right, but it doesn't answer everything. So I pick out another YouTube video, and I pick out another YouTube video, and about 5, maybe 6, 7 YouTube videos later, I've kind of pieced everything all together, and maybe a few articles that I've read off Medium, right? And so now I've got everything together. And then I talk to people, about Saito, other blockchains, but, Saito I have been talking to people about, and there's like, oh, that sounds interesting, Rob. So can you just send me that video that you said you were watching, or that article? I'd like to have a look at that. And they're like, yeah, sure. And then I think, oh, damn. Where's that video again? Damn, I didn't bookmark it. I can't find that video now. I can't remember what it was, right? So I was constantly watching these videos, piecing information together, but then kind of losing track of what video or what article I've read because, I'm researching many different blockchains, right? Not just one.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
You're doing a deep dive on, I'm getting a couple of things from this. One, it's the video first nature of learning, which is really interesting because I think Richard was just talking, and I've had the same experience. I think white papers are more and more useless in the field because they've shifted into marketing documents and they hide what they're doing. And they don't like to present the information that even leads you into it, what problems might be, right?
Absolutely,
Whereas if you're shifting with videos, you're kind of engaging with people who are filtering for people who are watching that kind of video, right? So you're dealing with videos for people who are trying to actually explain the technology. And maybe that's where education is leaning. So one, the video case, but two, are you doing this at the same time? Like, are you, when you're approaching a network like Saito, for instance, like routing work, are you thinking, okay, I've got to understand how this compares with braided chains. I've got to understand how this compares with, like, are you thinking about proof of stake? Do you have an anchor network that you think about when you approach other things?
No, I don't really, not really. I mean, I think it was just more, okay, I've heard about this new blockchain. What's so great about it? Okay, I'll look into it and I'll find out apparently what's so great about it. And so, Saito, that's got a different consensus mechanism. Oh, what consensus is that using? Why is that better? Right? So I look at it, it wasn't necessarily structured like that. It was just like some little hooks that I had that made me think, I'm drawn to this. Let me have a look at it, right? Because there were a few little YouTubers I was following who weren't like these big commercial YouTubers, right? I was following sort of YouTubers with a small following, right? That were, because I was looking into investing in new upcoming high potential blockchains, right? And so I followed a few YouTubers where I got this information from, and another one, for example, was BitTensor in the early days. And so I was like, okay, well, what's so good about this, right? And so I was looking for new projects to invest in. But in order to do that, I needed to understand what those projects are about and why they could capture the market or why they were better than what was currently out there. Yeah. And what I was finding as I was trying to get all this information together, I was either losing track of it or, essentially I was losing track of the information I got. I might have put a few notes down. So the idea of the book was to say, okay, now if I want to either research or refer back to a blockchain that I want to get an understanding of, well, now there's a book, right? There's a book that I can just pick up the book from my bookshelf and go, okay, this is all the research I've done. I'm now sharing it. And so anyone else who wants to go back and go, how does Saito work again? And blah, 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 blah. And maybe, should I invest in Saito? Because, yes, I remember reading about that, but I can't remember exactly how it works and, and all this. And why the golden ticket? Why isn't it just proof of routing work? What's this golden ticket thing for? Oh, now I remember, So you go to the book and you read it, you go straight into the chapter, you go, okay, now I know why Saito has such a damn good consensus mechanism. Right, I'll invest in Saito. Right? So, it was sort of both things. It was for research for me to invest in projects, but also share that knowledge with others who may want to do the same thing. It's the sharing of knowledge, which I believe is very powerful.
There is something fundamentally human about that too. I noticed, like Brick Block Cube, he took, I think it took him about 3 months. He's the one that put together that ticking time bomb article, and he kept looking for problems and digging into it and being like, "Look, there's got to be an issue here." Looking for it, and then he'd hit me up with questions, and he's like, "Well, can't I attack it this way?" And and some of them are difficult because you think, "Well, can you attack it this way?" And you think it through, and you're like, "No, because this happens. This is
Yeah.
So yeah, it's fascinating. I think anything that's sufficiently intellectually difficult, when you get into the point of understanding it, actually, you do want to communicate it with people. There's a
And absolutely. I mean, and white papers as well are not the easiest things to read for the average person. So I did use some of the white papers as a reference for my material, but then I reworded things in a way that could get the point across to people without any maths or code in there, to not make it overwhelming. So then they could look at it, they could read it, they could understand it. And as I said earlier, people probably don't need to read a 400-page book on Saito. They just probably want to read 10 or 15 pages in a chapter and go, you know what, that's enough information that I need to know to either go, right, is this something that I'm interested to either develop on, invest in, or just be curious to find out more about, right? You don't need a 400-page book. There are many blockchain books out there that are like 300-400 pages on that one blockchain, and I don't think your average person particularly requires that. In my opinion, I just found it quite surprising that there was no other book that was a comparative guide, because even many people I spoke to at the conference were like, "Oh wow, this is really useful. Like, this is really useful for me, because I'm always asking which blockchain should I get into, or which one should I invest in, or take interest in. And I don't really know, because I can't compare them."
It's one of the things I bump into when we've got new people in the community or who are exploring, right? So they've found us amongst other things, and it's very easy for us, greybeards, to kind of look at the space and think that people would understand. First there was Bitcoin, and then Ethereum came, and then 2017 was the avalanche of tokenization, and everything changed. And for people who newly arrived, they're not necessarily familiar with the difference between an L1 and the blockchains themselves, and a lot of the token projects that run on top of them, and they're not necessarily digging in. So there isn't really that space or ability. Like it's sort of, you go to Wikipedia, you can find articles on important blockchains, but you can't find anything that actually gives you a landscape. For instance,
Absolutely, yeah, and that's why I wrote the book in more an evolution, from the beginning to the modern and the now, and the upfront blockchains out there, the latest and greatest in a sense, right? And even even if you're a maxi, like maybe if you're a maxi, you might not want to read the book. You have to have an open mind to read this book, right? So you have to have an open mind. I mean, if I wasn't open-minded, I would never have discovered other blockchains, and I would never have discovered Saito, right? If I became a Bitcoin maxi. But even if you're a maxi, I would say that one thing that it might do is confirm, if you want. It depends. I know there's kind of confirmation bias, isn't there? But it might confirm that, okay, well, I've been in this bubble. I've been in this Ethereum bubble because I'm an Ethereum maxi. But if you just opened up your mind a little bit, you might then read this book and go, okay, now I can kind of see why, I think maybe the chain that I support compares to the others, and why it's better than the others. Or, actually, I've now changed my mind. But you need an open mind to do that.
Yeah. And that kind of bumps into one of the things I was wanting to ask, which was just in terms of curation of the chains you chose to talk about. Obviously, the space, there's only a select few proof of work chains. There's far more variations on proof of stake with and without sharding, etc. How did you settle on, obviously your wise decisions to include Saito and the like in this, set of chains that you talked about?
Yeah. Well, before I talk about Saito, I mean, basically, there are blockchains like Algorand in there, Solana, obviously Ethereum, there's Pulse Chain in there. So what I wanted to do was pick a few well-known chains, right, that, like, for example, Solana, Ethereum, and maybe Algorand, but then, pick some sort of new, lesser-known chain, but that have strong communities. So, Pulse Chain, for example, has a very strong community. Saito, I believe, has a very strong community, but I'll come to Saito in a minute. But what I try to do was pick a balance of chains that not just I'm interested in, but I know that other people are interested in, right? So I talk to various people through all kinds of different mediums. I talk to, people that I'm thinking of writing a book, which blockchain would you be interested in me including in the book, right? And I got lots of support for writing a chapter on, say, Pulse Chain. They've got a very strong community. I got lots of support about writing a chapter on Solana, right? And they really, people who weren't necessarily big Solana people, but were like, okay, I want to find out more about this. Yes, it would be very useful if you could write. So it was kind of based on some of the feedback I got from various sources, and in combination with my interests, but also not just talking about the big well-known chains. So I wanted to sort of balance it between some sort of relatively unknown chains to well-known chains, so that then there's some familiarity there, rather than talking about 10 chains that nobody's heard of, might
Yeah.
not have the same appeal. So it's sort of a bit of a balance. But
What I liked about the version I read, which I think predates so it's probably changed, but
it has a
I
little
really
bit.
liked how you did balance. You covered Cadena, for instance, which is the braid approach.
Yeah.
And the reason I liked it is that I found personally, like if for Richard and I, when you're involved in a project and you're saying, look, you should care about routing work, the way that fees are collected, these problems. It's fascinating to be able to look at other designs and you can see them succeed and fail from a different perspective because well, how does it work? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the problems with people when they go too narrow is they take what the developers say for granted.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like you get these really simple analogies that even help you think through the problem, right?
Yeah.
Like if you have multiple chains or you have multiple braids, are you scaling if there's an incentive to put the same transactions in two different blocks? Simple questions like that people don't necessarily think about it. You can if you understand comparatively, you can even talk to the devs and you'll say something and they'll be like, "What?" Because they're not even necessarily thinking of that sort of thing themselves. So I think it's really valuable as opposed to, because I think a lot of these days a lot of the development focus is basically proof of stake variants, and you cover those, but you also step outside of them. And I think that people who just have that proof of stake background, they don't even really understand proof of stake.
Yeah.
So that's what I thought was really great about the book.
That's great. That's great to hear, guys. I mean, it's just interesting to hear your feedback, because really the book was primarily targeted for sort of beginner to intermediate, not complete raw beginner, I'd say, but beginnerish to intermediate. It wasn't necessarily targeted for advanced readers who had written a whole blockchain themselves. So it's really good to hear your feedback. Although I do think it would have some appeal to advanced users like you guys, because it can just let you have a look at other blockchains to see, how they compare, and if nothing else, just for your own interest, right? So I still think there's something that advanced users or advanced developers of blockchains like yourselves can get out of it. So that's great to hear. Yeah.
The advantage, I think, for me with things like the salad chains, we call them salad chains. It's they add closure in a set of voting rings, and they leverage that closure in different ways to solve 20 solutions. It's intellectually very messy. I get them confused, like Aptos and Sway. They're different chains. I hear they're different chains, but in my mind, it's like it's the same chain. It's just like
That's interesting. Yeah, we'll come on to that later, I think. Yes.
So it's useful to actually have that kind of stuff written down.
The proof for me of that was the Cadena and Pulse chain sections, because I felt like I whizzed through them. They were quick, they were succinct, but I understood where they were coming from and what their approach was and what's novel about them within that space. I don't fully understand Cadena's braiding like I want to, but that's because it's been described to me now in a way that I understand how it's different.
That's
So
great.
that was really positive for me.
Yeah. Well, just on Saito as well, is in my opinion, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on this Saito podcast with you, but without the Saito chapter, I don't think that I wanted to make the book also insightful, not just saying that these are how all the different chains work and this is how they compare. Although I suppose in itself that's insightful, but I just felt that adding that Saito chapter really lifted the book to a new level to make it more insightful, because Saito does something completely different with, its consensus mechanism, the way it views the blockchain space and incentives and everything like that. And so, that's why it was also featured in the introductory part of my book as well, to really engage the reader to go, well, this is interesting. I want to read more now. And I think without that Saito chapter, in my opinion, it wouldn't have the same level of insight or appeal. So, I really, it's hats off to you guys for what you've done, because I really think that's going to help to lift the book to another insightful level. And in later versions, I will be adding a little bit more on that as well. Yeah. Mm.
Well, I mean, we're
That'd be
delighted
amazing.
when people talk about Saito. I agree. I actually think that doing routing work and working on Saito, I think it actually does clarify a lot of problems that are latent in other approaches. But this is why the comparative approach is needed,
Yeah.
because like even a simple thing like Richard, the braided approach. My criticism of it is
Yeah.
that people think about it as a scaling technique, and it's like, okay, yeah, we've got different braids, and they're each confirming the blocks on other ones. So it's kind of like four chains running at the same time, and we're checking and we're validating. And so if you want to reorg one, you kind of need to reorg the other three.
Mm.
The problem is, in order for this to happen, as I see with the braided approach, you're scaling, but you're now requiring the computers to validate content on four braids, which means your own throughput processing is divided by four.
Yes.
And so people think, oh, well, that's great. That's a wonderful scaling approach. But they're kind of assuming that there's a lot of free computation that's just available
Yes.
in the environment that may not be, right? And
Mm. Good
I've
point.
never had anyone, it's only really by taking a comparative approach that you start to think about this,
Yeah.
because you might run into a situation like DAGs have the same issue. If
Mm.
everyone has the same mempool, everyone's putting the same transactions into their blocks. So, you're reducing latency, but you're not really scaling, or there are these limits that people don't think about if they just get hyper obsessed about one design.
Well, that's
So,
interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting point, David. And I might even add that as a little comment in the book for honestly, for a future version. That might even be something I might look into and either get the answer to, or if I don't have the answer, I can still leave it as a possible issue with those blockchains, without sort of making it like an opinionated thing, but to point that out, because I do think that's very,
it's
very interesting. Yes.
it's not positive or negative. It's more an example of these are the kind of things I think
Hmm.
people won't even think about
Yep.
unless they're taking it from a comparative perspective. Because if you're
Yep.
focused on one architecture, you just go, well, of course, braiding. Why braiding? Because it makes the 51% attack harder, you know?
Yes.
But in the comparative approach, you're like, well, we've all got fees, and the fees are incentivizing infrastructure, and they're going
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
blocks. And how much money can I process, you know?
Well, I think
Yeah.
Uh,
I think another part of the whole issue, and what makes this difficult, and partially what makes the book impressive, is it gets back to the Facebook bus example we used to have, where in a lot of cases, people, we'd say people have invented the aeroplane, right, blockchain, and then they've sequentially changed the features, right? So you start off with an airplane, but you add bigger seats and a cargo access area and the toilet. Eventually, what you have is a bus, but
Yeah.
people are still believing that it's an airplane. And I
Yeah.
think that comparative mentality is really, really important, because it's so hard to keep all of the properties that you need to still be an
yeah.
airplane in your
Yes.
mind. And it's very interesting. I think when we talked to Dan from Radix, it was only through his thoroughgoing explanation of how they shard and the way they cut up the possible sharding space that I understood, you know, some of like the valid criticisms of sharding and some of the things that are not. And I think I learned a lot about possible solutions in the space through that discussion, which I'd never picked up
Mm.
before. And I don't think without that comparative thing, you wouldn't get that, because I would have just simply
You're
said, "Oh, well,
talking about a
Radix is
circle
sharded."
and how sharding is just expanding or contracting the.
Right. Well, so one of the classic problems with sharding is you lose a property. What I'm aiming at is you lose properties like universal broadcast. So one of the big things in Bitcoin is if you've got a key and I know it, I can an address, I can send it money, and I don't need to ask anyone's permission. It's really important. If you shard, one of the issues is someone's got to tell you what shard that address is
Mm.
on. And
Yeah.
Radix have a funny solution where they've actually, the way they shard would cover your address is going to be in a particular shard, and you can work that out just by knowing how many shards there are, because it's essentially a circle of all the possible addresses. And when you shard into those. So you've still got to get across shards, which has some overhead, but at least you don't have to ask centralized guy, where do I find the shard I'm looking for so I can send
Exactly.
that address
Yeah.
something. Super interesting mental. It was one of the most pleasant discussions I've had in the space in a while, just because you suddenly realize, oh, I've got to think about this really differently, and you rattle back through all of your perceptions on sharding to think about what things still apply and what are wiped away by this approach. Right? It's very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And, I think on another note, or a more general note, is that I just find it fascinating seeing all these different, or reading and learning about all these different solutions, even if there are still questions and doubts. I just find it very interesting to see all the different approaches that some of these different blockchains are taking. And even if that does result in failure, right, in some way, or it doesn't prevail in the end, the way I see it is that, people can criticize these things because other communities, like Casper and Cadena at the moment are kind of at war with each other. Those two communities don't like each other because they both have a different solution, DAGs versus sharding in Cadena, and they just really are at war with each other. But the way I see it is that, all ideas are welcome, right? Some ideas may not prevail. Most ideas actually may not prevail in the end. But those ideas can spawn new ideas, just like without Bitcoin, we probably wouldn't have any of these blockchains. We probably wouldn't have Saito, right? So, without,
Absolutely.
you need ideas, and ideas are welcome. And you never underestimate the power of an idea. Yeah,
Yeah.
So, how do people talk to you about the book? I'm curious
yeah,
about this
yeah.
because we've talked about your motives in writing it. Do you find that when people read it, do you think they're coming from the same perspective? Are they looking for like I want a financial understanding? What kind of feedback do you get from people?
Great question, Dave. It's a bit early to say yet at the moment in terms of people who've read the book because, I know you guys have, but other people I spoke to haven't physically finished or got through the book yet. Like I know people who have physically bought the book, people even local, but they haven't actually finished the book yet. But they are.
They're judging the book by the cover. We're still in
Yes,
this
I
right?
imagine. Yeah, the cover does help, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah. I've got people that I know locally who are. Oh God, some of them I was staggered who bought them, like 60-year-old bus drivers and all sorts. Oh yeah, no, I want to learn about Bitcoin. I want to learn how it works. Like I really want to have a look at it. And I'm thinking,
Yeah,
is that because it's a bull market and the price is going up? Like everyone just wants to suddenly get into it. But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
a lot of it is, a lot of it generally is about, okay, yes, I want to learn because I want to know which project to invest in. Generally, it's not about, because I want to develop on a particular one or because I want to, it's generally about, okay, I want to invest in a particular project, which one is best. But the thing that's different about my book is it doesn't really talk much about price at all. It's a little bit on tokenomics in there just to kind of make it complete. This is the tech and this is the tokenomics. But the sort of
It's part of the design.
it's
Yeah,
part of the design, right?
you
So,
know.
but I didn't talk about price or price forecasts or price history or very, very little about that. And the reason why I did that is because I wanted to send a message to people that if you're going to be a long-term investor, you really need to understand the fundamentals. This is not really about trading. If you're trading, you just want to look at charts and
Yeah.
understand Fibonacci, whatever you call them, and moving averages and that's fine, right? But if you want to be a long-term investor, you really need to understand like the tokenomics or the token economy and the tech to understand, okay, well, this one looks like it might have higher scale potential. Okay, well, if it's got higher scale potential, that could be one that could be more adopted more readily. That one's got better potential than this one, blah, 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 blah. This is the one I'm going to look at. So that's generally what people have fed back to me, but they haven't necessarily read the book and completed it yet and told me, hey, this is what I like or don't like about it. I have had a couple of people who read the Saito chapter who find it very interesting. So that's been great to hear. Some people haven't actually necessarily read the book from start to finish either. They skip to a particular chapter about a
Yeah.
blockchain that they're interested in and go, I want to find out about Solana, but I don't know much about it. They've gone straight into the Solana chapter, which you could kind of do, I suppose, as long as you've got some fundamental understanding of blockchain and proof of stake and things like that. Yeah, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think the way you build through that makes a lot of sense. Someone who really fundamentally understands Bitcoin and Ethereum could skip forward.
yeah,
You would be a little lost if you didn't understand either of those things and you went to learn
I
about
believe,
Solana.
I
But
think
without
so.
repeating yourself, it would be impossible to do it.
It would be hard. I think you're right. It would be hard. And, one of the things I decided to do with the book, guys, which I don't know what you think, is that what I decided to do generally was rather than explain all the concepts up front, right? So, like what a lot of books would do is they'd say, right, this is how a blockchain works. This is how a DAG works. This is how a permission blockchain works. This is what permissioned and permissionless is. And they'd lay all that out before delving into the chapters. What I decided to do was,
Mm.
that could be a bit overwhelming, because you're going to read about a DAG and go, okay, but what's the context here? How's a DAG used? Which blockchain uses it, right? So I
Yeah.
decided to say, right, I'm not going to explain DAGs until I get to the Casper chapter,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to explain braiding or whatever until I get to the Cadena chapter. So then you've got that fundamental understanding in context of the chain itself. So I just felt that that was personally a better way to approach it. But I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, for me, it occurs to me as being really kind of necessary just because like we were talking earlier on about the kind of pre 16 era and we're like, the way I flippantly put it to David the other day was back when ideas still mattered in blockchain. But like with the scaling debates in Bitcoin, one of the things I remember was talking to people in the community then who were running nodes, who were
Yeah.
genuinely like there were people who were proud of having put Bitcoin nodes on the first Raspberry Pis that could handle it,
Yeah.
and there were discussions about how much storage would you need and would it be people were thinking practically about if I want to be part of the Bitcoin network for 50
Hmm.
years until I don't pay power bills anymore. How would I do that? Like what equipment will I need?
Mm.
Is it likely that a household internet connection will be sufficient or will I get charged too much? That helped people, like that helped build, I think, David and me very uh sort of an intuitive sense of how a lot of the stresses in a blockchain play
Hmm.
off against each other, right? Because
Yeah.
you get it at that fundamental, you've kind of lived through it, you've watched it grow and solve problems. And it's hard to give people a catch up on that in something that's still basically as new as the area, right? So you're going to have to
Yeah.
pick one way to go. And I think you're right. One of the ways is to say, here's what the scaling challenge is understood, one way. Here's what it is understood another way. Here's what people, let's have a discussion about decentralization, what that might mean. Like you say, what does permissionless mean? And I think those are all interesting topics, but really risk being too abstract
Yes.
in themselves, especially for anyone who's coming along saying, "How do I learn about blockchain?"
Yes. Exactly. Yes.
I
Yeah.
think it's the right approach too. I think one of the big problems we have communicating, not just us, but people in the space, is Richard, what you alluded to with that definitional slippage, right?
Yeah.
Like everything is justified in terms of decentralization. And people
Mm.
don't dig down and say, well, I'm really talking about this other thing. What is this other thing I'm talking about? And I think it's because most people can't, or they haven't
Mm.
really thought it through, or because it's ideological, right? Like decentralization is in people's minds the property of hard money in Bitcoin, right?
Mm.
So you can't dig down. And I think it's a big problem trying to take people who have an interest in some reason and saying, actually, no, your taxonomy and your worldview is, it's off-centered. You should really be defining things this way. Uh, so I think it would be a huge hurdle and a huge obstacle in the way that you're doing things is better, because you're
Yeah.
going to target people who have an interest in, in this network, or in this ticker maybe, as opposed to let's have a long convoluted discussion that's more theoretical that people might not be interested in. Probably
Yeah.
not.
Right. Mm.
So
Cool.
Richard, do you have any more questions?
I think
We
it's
kind of have
uh,
general questions.
yeah. So the one real last thing I think I wanted to ask was just on the book format. Like, what made you think? Oh, you talked a little bit about it almost being your own personal notes, but what made you choose the book and self-publishing, and what were some of the challenges around that versus a blog or Medium post or
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I always like reading books, right? And I like reading tech books. I've read the odd storybook here and there, but I really like, I have a background in tech, and I've bought all kinds of different books about blockchain and Bitcoin and whatnot. And I like books. And as I said earlier, I like the fact that with a book you can go back to it very easily. You don't have to dig through all these different videos to remember how does this work, how does that work. You just pick up the book from your bookshelf and you go to that chapter, you go, okay, that's how it works again. I mean, I've done that recently with Bitcoin. I was like, how do derivation keys work again with HMAC 512? And I go straight to the chapter. And Bitcoin work within 5 minutes. I'm like, oh, that's how it works. Yes, got it.
That's
Like
a,
so.
so.
So
how
you
do I
also had
recover
a
how do I
yeah.
recover my keys?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good one. Oh, yeah, exactly.
It's hysterical you said that because I had a friend who's sort of peripheral to the space in tech, but not in blockchain specifically. Hit me up this morning with like, I've got this great idea. Let's build and sell a quantum resistant blockchain, just
Yeah,
like copy Bitcoin. And I was like, well, how are you going to do the elliptic curve and match the addresses? It's exactly that stuff. And I had to quickly go back and check, like,
yeah.
how does this work? But I can
And that
actually,
that's what's useful about books, in my opinion. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's just my opinion. I mean, maybe there is a different way, but if you just got a book there on the shelf, you go, okay, yeah, that's how it works, right? I don't have to go to a YouTube video and watch someone with a terrible accent that I don't like, or who's speaking at the speed of light, and then I've got to, okay, in YouTube I can set it on a lower, slower speed and whatnot, but then I've got to skip back and forward. And with the book,
Yeah,
it's much more relaxed. You can see it there, it's printed. You can read it at your own leisure. You don't have to listen to someone's annoying voice. I mean, but yeah. So on the book format, without sort of diverting too much, I mean, the thing is I structured it largely around two things. I suppose was the trilemma and consensus mechanisms, because I believe that from what if you look at any blockchain, one of the first things they'll put in their marketing website is, we can solve the trilemma, and we are one of the first to solve the trilemma, and blah 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 blah, and we're doing it this way. So it's obviously the case that the trilemma is a problem that needs to be solved or removed, right? So as in Saito, it essentially reduces it to a dilemma between decentralization and scalability, right? So that's that one, and it's using this incentive mechanism, economic incentive mechanism, right, through a collection and sharing of fees, right? It's a very very different approach, right? But there's obviously a way that each different blockchain is trying to tackle it, and so that for me was a very interesting way to sort of lay the foundation in the book that there's some problems that these blockchains are solving. We're very much not finished with this yet, right? It's still
yeah,
evolving, and this is how these different chains claim that they've solved the trilemma, or are claiming to,
yeah.
even though I actually deep down believe that most haven't, but they
I,
are
I
just
don't believe
claiming to.
anyone. I don't believe anyone but Saito solves it.
Yeah,
But as you
I
point
totally
out,
agree. I totally agree with
is
that.
it
Yeah. Yes.
is it a solution if it's just reducing it to the two-way trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think for us, the interesting thing is we've stopped talking about Saito as a trilemma solution
Yeah.
because there's all of this POS nonsense about the trilemma that comes out, right? Like your book,
Mhm.
interesting by comparatively looking at it. I think it makes it easier to see that because people can
Yeah.
say, well, there are all these different things. Do I actually believe? What do I believe? What do I not believe? But we've
Yeah.
we've actually stepped away from it because we think it just invites confusion.
yeah,
Mm.
I went to a meetup here that was sponsored by I think Algorand, and one of the speakers, kind of from Algorand, introduces so Algorand solved the trilemma back in blah blah blah, and then we did this, and audience nodding along. Uh,
Hmm.
it's sort of thrown out in that way that
Yeah,
it's become pablum. It doesn't really mean anything. It's become meaningless
no.
because of overuse and
It
mischaracterizations so
combines with the
often.
lack the lack of definition on the terms, which I think is why, like if you had to start the book and say, what is decentralization? You get into a position where it's really hard to explain why these chains are saying they solve decentralization. It's kind of like Schrodinger's box, where
Mm.
you have to maintain, like, to really talk about a bunch of approaches, you need to kind of have definitions that are so fluid that they can flow into a state maybe where maybe that makes sense.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it's not easy. I mean, even in my book, I struggle to necessarily, clarify some of these things. But I think I do think that also in a later version of my book, I will be adding a few more of the Saito insights on the trilemma or the not trilemma. And I have watched a few of your videos in the past, David, about this budget problem that Vitalik had with the security
Yeah.
budget, and if you shifted budget over to here, now he's reducing security, and But I liked all those kind of insights, and it's not. I'm not going to take the credit for it. It's your insights, but I guess
No,
the
I
other
think
credit I
just
take is for explaining them in hopefully a simple way that people can grasp. But you
we're,
know,
we're in the
yeah,
we're in the same situation, right? Like a lot
yeah,
of this, I think for us, because we started with rodent work and we started with it as a scaling approach. So if you
mm,
remember the white paper, that's why the scalability trilemmas was one of the earlier ways that
yeah,
we talk about how do you scale? Well, you scale by paying for infrastructure. And then it's
mm,
the effort to explain this and how does it work that you end up getting pulled into these different perspectives because other people talk about them.
mm,
So yeah, I mean, I think the economic one is powerful, and I think that's actually violated by a lot of the tech approaches, right? Like sharding. People,
mm,
it's not like sharding, it violates the principle of decentralization because you're really going to multiple chains that are bound together with the same ticker. And if you think about it as fee throughput, it helps get you to see that. But a lot of the time, people kind of end up thinking, oh, well, look, it's four chains instead of one. Of course, we're more scalable. Of course, this solves the trilemma.
mm.
Um,
And
so
what I'm noticing is, without sort of diverting too much, is that a lot of the blockchains, what they're doing is they're mainly focusing on scalability and TPS, and now we won't go down the TPS rabbit hole. I know that that's not necessarily the best metric to use, but they're all talking about, we can scale up to this and we can scale up to that. And what I'm noticing is that scalability is kind of very visible, I think, because you can look on the blockchain explorer and see how many, transactions per second are being
yeah,
processed. But decentralization, a lot of these blockchains are sort of putting it a little bit on the back burner because it's a little bit harder to see that, it's a little less visible. So, Hyperlink
mm,
would recently come out
yeah,
and, we can do hundreds of thousands of TPS. But when I started digging into it, I went on the block explorer and they've actually only got four internal
yeah,
validators. So you could actually
yeah,
see those four block proposers on the block explorer. They only got four, right? So,
yeah.
but that you only see that if you actually really dig into it, right?
My
So,
favorite, my favorite EOS story is there was a point. Apparently, I got
I,
this from people that I trust,
there
and they
was.
were saying that apparently there was a point where they had four machines that had a full copy of the blockchain, but they
uh,
were actually four NICs on the same hard drive.
yeah, yeah,
So they were faking the number of nodes, that had the blockchain
yeah,
because no
yeah.
one wants to save that kind of data. So just
Um,
parasitically leeching.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, and the other thing was about the book format. Trilemma, and also I broke it down by different consensus mechanisms. I suppose that was just I don't know. It just seemed the natural way to structure it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's an evolution from, if you like, proof of work to proof of stake to some of these other,
Mm-hmm.
consensus mechanisms like UMA consensus in Bitensor and
Yeah.
routing work in Saito. So it helped the evolution of the book, but it also
Mm-hmm.
helped to split it up. People might just be interested in proof of stake, and who are not proof of work fans or whatever can go to the proof of stake blockchains, look at those.
I,
It would just seem
I,
the fair way to group it. I certainly didn't want to group it in terms of fastest and slowest chains, or that
Yeah.
would be that wouldn't go down too well, would it? So yeah,
well, I think it makes sense. I mean, I can't imagine if no matter what happens, I can't imagine a future course at some institute on the history of
Mm.
blockchain that didn't start with,
Yeah.
hopefully pre-Nakamoto consensus, like what were
Mm.
people doing,
Yeah.
what changed with Bitcoin, what is proof of work, and then, what is proof of stake, and how did that, how did that change things, and then from there go
Exactly.
into,
They're going to have to. I mean, I think a lot of the one of the reasons I think your book is important is that if we take a look at the stuff that academics are doing, they're going back to the 1980s. Validators, closure, Lamport style mechanisms. And I think there's this sense in academia, especially in the States, that this is the right way to do things because that's the approach that's closest to the consensus mechanisms they know.
Mm,
So
mm,
it's kind of the
mm,
approach that feels the most computer sciencey in a way. And the more open-ended proof of work, you don't just have a closed ring of validators, is more alien. People don't necessarily know how to reason about them. So they prefer the metrics even that let proof of stake uh, kind of claim to be more technically advanced.
mm,
yeah, I get the feeling, that people love proof of stake because you can talk about the balance between the number of validators and certain other results, security or whatever.
Yeah.
So you end up with, generating a paper mill of things you can talk about in terms of that relationship, rather than with something even just like proof of work, where it's like, well, does this work or not? It's a much more theoretical discussion thing.
So we're kind of almost an hour in. I guess the
yeah.
question is there anything we haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about, or is there
Um,
anything you'd like us to ask you?
yeah. Well. Well, there
How
will
much
be.
where
There,
can we buy it? I think it's on Amazon, by the way. You got it
well,
on
It is.
Amazon? I don't know if the physical book is there.
I like your questions, because sometimes I want people to ask me a question. I'm ready to answer this question, but I haven't been asked it yet. Now, how can I answer the question without being asked it? It's a bit difficult, right? Like, for example, I'm on this DeFi podcast, generally not every Friday, but most Fridays, and I'm waiting for them to ask me a question because I'm often a guest on there. It's like a
Yeah.
group podcast, and I'm often a guest on there, and I'm waiting for them to ask me a question so I can turn around and say, "Ah, I got the answer to this. Saito solves this. Let's talk about Saito." Now they haven't asked me that right question that allows me to, yeah, I do like very good questions, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'll talk about the updates. So I'm doing an interim update at the moment, which will be part of a larger second edition update coming out next year. So I'm going to add some extra things in there, and I will be, elaborating on a few more things in a Saito chapter. And as I said earlier, Sato's view of the trilemma or not trilemma, and some extra insights there. I've also got a nice little comparison table of different blockchains, a summary, tokenomics, decentralization, scalability, tickle cross, and things like that. I think that's quite notable. I think that's something that some people have been asking for. And I will eventually, in the second edition, probably have an extra couple of chapters, maybe Cardano and Sui. I know I've had a fair few, a
Is it
fair bit of
Sui?
demand out.
Is that what people say?
What's that?
Is it Sui?
Sui, yeah,
Is it
SUI, yeah,
Sui or
Sui.
Sui
Some
or
people say sway, I think, but
I'd say sway,
I'm
which
not
I think is
sophisticated enough to say sway,
influence from the Chinese opinion system.
yeah,
For me,
yeah.
I always said sway, but I was never sure.
I call
Yeah.
them
Other
Yoku. I
shows say
call them
Sui,
Yoku
but
creatures.
yeah, other
But
shows say Sui, but yeah, I
we
don't know.
have Saito, so every
Yeah,
show's
yeah,
got to
yeah.
have it.
Seiko Saito. Yeah, I flip between the two actually, um, but yeah, so yeah, there'll be a bit of extra material in there, and in the second edition, what I hope to do is, offer it at a cheap enough price for the first 3 or 6 months, so those who have already bought the first can buy the second cheaply without having to go, oh, I've got to fork out extra cost here. So I'll try and make that as cheap as possible within the promotion period. But yeah, there will be an interim update before that, which will be available on the Kindle and PDF versions, which they can sync to immediately. Obviously, the paperback version that won't happen, but newcomers of the book would get that interim update, so that'll be quite nice.
So, question:
Yeah,
you're self-publishing this? What's the kind of turnaround when you hit a
mm,
point where you're like, okay, I like the content because you're doing the digital updates, but when you
yeah.
actually want to push out a new physical version, you're using kind of a drop shipper. Are you getting the books to Amazon? Because I remember when I read it, it was you were digitally distributing it, and I bought the PDF and brought it
Yeah.
that way. What's the physical loop on this? Is it like
Yeah, it's great actually. It's really good. I mean, that's the great thing about this self-publishing thing. One, self-publishing, there's no upfront cost, right? So if you were a classic publishing old school route, it would be, probably a 5K upfront cost and whatnot, right? So the great thing is there's no upfront cost, but Amazon take commission with each physical copy that they ship on demand. They print it on demand. It's a print on demand model, and the way it works is if I want to do some updates, I do the updates. I go, great, this is fine. It's all looking nice. It's in just in Word, right? And then you convert it to PDF, and then you can preview it on Amazon KDP. It's Kindle Desktop Publishing. You can preview it in there. Very nice previewer. Make any corrections, and then you go, yeah, I'm happy with this. Submit, and then within probably sometimes a few hours to a day, it's approved. Yeah, we've approved your updates. And then the new version is available for new people to buy physical or digital. That's it. It's just it's just an upload,
Nice.
and then Amazon printed on demand. Yeah.
New school, old school.
Yeah.
So
Mine came in 36 hours, I think. So I was pleased.
Yeah.
Well, being in Australia, you're used to being on the wrong end of watching
Yeah.
it leave the New Jersey warehouse and end up in Dallas, and then get back to Pittsburgh and then fly to Honduras and then to Singapore or whatever it is. So it's quite nice that they kind of just arrived in a day or so.
It's good. I mean, the author copies, so I can actually ship author copies just for me at like a discounted price. The only thing is they take sometimes 2 or 3 weeks to get because Amazon prioritize author copies right at the back of the queue because it's less profitable for Amazon. So they prioritize all the customer copies, which is fine, I suppose. But the author copies to me, like when I wanted to print out 10 or 20 copies to take them to the local conference to dish out to people, they arrived just on time, actually 2 days before the conference. I was like, oh my God, I got them just on time because Amazon, they don't rush with those, right? But yeah, and I was able to dish them out at the conference and help promote my book that way, which is another nice little way to promote the book. Just dish out them 3 copies that I thought people might be interested in. So yeah,
well, it's the book is Ross Green, Essential Guide to Blockchain Platforms. Yeah.
Yep.
If you're interested, you can get it on Amazon. It's got a lovely Saito chapter too. So thank you for coming on the show. Pleasure to chat.
Great. Thank
even
you.
Even if the Australian presence is overwhelming.
Well, actually, I watched just before I go, I watched a video stream by Charles Hoskinson at the recent conference, and he said, "You know what? I want to come to Australia physically again." He goes, "I've been there before, and I loved all you guys. You were fantastic. I loved every Australian that was there except Craig Wright." Yeah, that was gold.
Yeah.
That was gold. Yeah.
Okay.
On that note,
great. Well, then, thanks for coming on.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks, Ross.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.